Dr. Lourdes Torres.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Wonderful to see you all here. My name is Lourdes Torres. I am the chair of the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies, and I'm really happy to be part of this program and to see you all here. So I'm just to tell you what we're going to do today. I'm going to introduce the speaker. We're going to talk for about half hour, and then I will open it up to you all to ask questions. Okay. So we're really happy to have Karla Cornejo Villavicencio here. She is the author of Undocumented Americans, published in 2020. The book was a National BookAward finalist, and it was named a Best Book of the Year by the LA Times, the New York Times, NPR, the New York Public Library, Book Riot, Library Journal, and many other publications. Her novel, Catalina, published this year, has already received rave reviews. The Washington Post proclaimed it a, quote, singular achievement. The New York Times Book Review called it, quote, a sparkling fiction debut. And this book has already just came out in July. It's already been longlisted for a National Book Award. I just finished it and it's amazing. So I encourage you all to buy a copy outside. One theme that both of these books have in common is that they focus in different ways on the challenges, joys, hardships of being an undocumented immigrant in the US. So for those who aren't familiar with the books, I'll just give a tiny little synopsis, and then you'll learn more about the books from our conversation. So in Undocumented Americans, Karla chronicles the experiences of a diverse group of undocumented immigrants. She went around the country, interviewed people, and told their stories at the same time that she told her story of being undocumented in the United States. She talked to workers who were brought in to clean up the mess after 9/11, after Hurricane Sandy. She talks to people who were brought in Flint, Michigan during the water crisis to work there, but they weren't given access to water because they didn't have IDs, state IDs. She talks to kids whose parents have been deported. She talks to people who decide to go and stay in churches for a long time in sanctuary as a way of not getting deported. So she had really deep, intimate conversations with these folks. And at the same time, she talks about her own situation as well as her family. So it's a very different portrayal of undocumented immigrants than what we see in the media, and especially in the right-wing media. Catalina tells a story of a young woman who's in her last year of college at Harvard. And she's also someone who is an undocumented young woman living with her parents, her grandparents in Queens. When we meet her, she's about to begin her last year at Harvard. So that's the brief synopsis. Okay, get to the conversation. So as I mentioned, both of these books deal with one of their themes, one of many themes is undocumented Americans. Could you talk about why you decided to write these novels or these books? They're two different genres, kind of dealing with the theme of being undocumented in the US. How does the genre, fiction versus nonfiction, impact the story you're trying to tell?
I hope you can all hear me. I sometimes have a soft voice. Nice to meet you all. I am really excited to be here. To answer your question, I guess the writing came first. So for the first book, I wanted to write about many people who are usually not written about, in this case, undocumented people. And I used myself as like a bridge between them and the readers. So I wrote about myself and the ways that I related to these people or didn't. And so it had to be based on reporting and conversations with people that happened because of trust that I built up over time. So they ended up telling me things kind of because I had told them of myself as well. And with the novel, it was just me. And part of it is because after doing the press for the first book, I was so socially exhausted that I just needed to completely remove myself from society. So I was just writing at night and sort of sleeping during the day while writing Catalina. I became very pale. It was like an important, it's a sweet memory for me. It's just me being alone with my thoughts at 3 a.m. I had like the blue lights on that we all got during lockdown. And I just like lie in the dark on the yoga mat, vibing until something comes out. So it was more of a solitary endeavor.
Okay, well, it's interesting that this is called a nonfiction, but it's very creative in the way that you write it. Karla's also a journalist, but when she went around and did these interviews, from what I understand, you weren't recording folks, right? You weren't recording their language or even writing. You would go back and then, and they would telling you these stories in Spanish. And you would summarize what they were offering in English. Could you just talk about that process of writing nonfiction in that way and the whole role of translation in that process?
I think the experience is very common for like lots of kids of immigrants who grow up translating for their parents or family members. It's translation is like a deep literary skill. And what we're doing is like interpreting just like what's what best we can do at that moment. And so I tried to kind of mirror that just sort of movement that so many kids of immigrants have done, this translation. By when I was doing interviews with my subjects in Spanish, I would kind of translate on the spot English. Also, I think in English, and Spanish is my first language. And so it kind of was very natural for me to go in and out of English and Spanish. Like when I do therapy, my therapist and I do English and Spanish. It helps me to be able to think in both. And so I did that. So I took notes. I didn't record because this was 2016. Like Trump had just been elected. People were scared. I was undocumented still. I was really scared. Like I would write down my lawyer's number in Sharpie on my arm when I had to take a flight. And so we were all scared. And so I just wanted again to build up a layer of trust, and a recording device wasn't going to do that. I was also kind of paranoid at that time. Again, Trump had just been elected. He's made his feelings on immigrants very clear. And so I didn't want people to be able to find my subjects. Like I didn't want people to be able to trace back to them, especially since they were telling me like illegal things, right? Working without documents, how they got there, just how they lived their lives was in an underground world that I also didn't want to expose. So I, made a choice to destroy my notes afterwards because I thought I could be subpoenaed. Like I thought there was a chapter that I do in Miami on like the botanicas and sort of pharmacies and strip malls that sell like pretty strong pharmaceuticals, like without a prescription. And I didn't want to have my work lead to the crackdown of like, I don't work for the DEA, so I made that choice.
Okay. Well, you bring up Mr. Trump and the 2016 election when you started this text. And now here we are 2 weeks away from another election where that man is running again. And so, we've had 8 years, I guess. And it seems to me that the discourse around immigrants has gotten worse, that the portrayals are, if they were horrible in 2016, they're horrific now. And it seems that there's not many counter stories to that portrayal of immigrants other than books like this. And so I wonder first how you see, whether you agree or your take on how immigrants are being portrayed today, 8 years later after this book came out and Trump's first term in office, hopefully only term in office. If you could talk about where you think we are now as opposed to where we were back then. And the narrative, why aren't we making, I think, any headway in changing this horrible narrative that we hear all the time, and there's very little resistance to that?
Well, I think every 4 years, when there's re-elections at stake, politicians find it very useful to be as xenophobic as possible because it riles people up. It's like a very heated emotion. Demographics are changing in this country and white people are really scared about it. They don't like it. And so it makes sense in the sense that immigrants are a fantastic scapegoat.
Yeah.
On the other hand, like, why is there no more headway in terms of narratives? I mean, I find, using myself as the example that I know, I'm an extremely, I would say famous immigrant. Like, I write about being an immigrant and people know me as an immigrant. And I also have been validated so many times by the establishment. I did my undergrad at Harvard. I went for my PhD at Yale, didn't finish. I've written for just about everywhere. But when I did my very first interview for my novel, Catalina, with someone I really admired, he didn't read the book. And he didn't feel like he had to read the book because he felt this is a story about an undocumented girl. You're undocumented. I know the story. And so the questions that I were asked were demeaning. He was like, tell me what you feel you owe your parents. How much do you feel in debt to your parents? Is your relationship with, he asked me this question, he said, what was your first night at Harvard like?
Yeah.
And his son went to Yale. He knows what a night at an Ivy League, it's standard generic dorm furniture. And so what he wanted me to do was tell him a story about how intellectually intimidated I was to be at Harvard. Unfortunately for them, that's not the case. I'm a monster. And I have not for a moment doubted my intellectual abilities. I have doubted many other abilities, but not that. And so, but ever since I sort of started doing promo for the Undocumented Americans, people were obsessed with the fact that I'd gone to Harvard. I was undocumented when I went to Harvard. And my own publisher, would not stop describing me as Karla Cornejo Villavicencio, one of the first undocumented immigrants to graduate from Harvard. And I was like, I'm 31. That happened when I was 17. It was really hard to both not be followed by how rare it was for someone of my background to go to Harvard, but also people really wanted to hear the story about what a culture shock it was. And so much of my work is responding to narratives and to scripts that people already lay out for me. So they know what I'm going to say, they know what I'm going to write like, they know what I'm going to sound like. And so I have to always be thinking about how to preempt them, how to respond, how to deflect, but it always seems to be a response.
So that leads to the next question. Given that that's been your experience, or maybe that's why you decided to write a book about a young woman, undocumented, who goes to Harvard, right? And there's a lot of autobiographical elements in the novel, and then there's other differences that are huge. So I wonder, do you think about this as auto fiction, or how in terms of the genre that you're using and the fact that you use some elements of your own story, but then there's others that are very different? Did you talk about making that decision to tell this story in this way?
Sure. It is very rare for someone with my background to have the opportunity to publish a second book, especially a literary fiction book. Apologies for the cursing, but I felt like since I was already in this space and the spotlight on me, I wanted to fuck things up a little bit. So I knew that people were going to read my own story into everything I wrote regardless. And I knew that people were really curious about Harvard. And so I was like, okay, I'll give them what they want, but then I'll make them regret that they asked for it. So I wrote this story about this young undocumented girl at Harvard. And I wrote it as I made it as fun as possible. I wanted it to feel like eating cotton candy, or like when you eat popcorn and you can't stop unless you eat the whole thing. Like I wanted the book to feel that way. It's one of the reasons why it's so short, because I wanted to lure people in with like the sweet, the honey, and then the bite comes. It's if you can read it and sort of superficially and kind of just like vibe out to it, but if you just pay just a single moment of attention, I think I make some cuts that are pretty deep. And so that is what led to me writing a novel that was starring a character that had some autobiographical similarities, because that benefits both the character, Catalina, and me, because I'm older, like I'm 35, I've achieved the American dream according to, the public many times over. And so I lend a credibility to the book saying, okay, I dare you to try to deny this girl who is dismissed by most of the world, like a young, brown, undocumented girl. And I wanted Catalina to mythologize me in order to confuse people and to deflect attention from me, because I'm not necessarily trying to like be understood. I just want to kind of like send my little soldiers across the bridge, and once they're there, they can just do their own thing.
Well, it is a page turner, I can tell you, and I'm looking forward to teaching it in classes in the future. One of the things I really like about it is your exploration of being a Latino or any person of color in a predominantly white campus, and you talk about some of the challenges in there. One thing that resonated with me was when you talk about Catalina being afraid of messing up, because if she messed up, it doesn't only reflect on her, it reflects on her classmates, it reflects on her professors even. So if you're a minoritized person in a predominantly white campus, you have all this pressure on you to succeed, because if you don't, the repercussions are even greater than for just the individual, but for the whole community. And I thought that the way you portrayed all the anxieties of students was really powerful, dealing with depression, being the character, as Karla said, is very confident of her intellectual ability, but there's all these pressures from different people, from her professors, from her friends, from her family, about who she's supposed to be. Could you talk about that, that kind of pressure coming from all sides about what a Latino student should be presenting, how they should be presenting, how they should be moving through the world as a college student?
Catalina really struggles with her mental health. And I think one of the ways that this weird pressure gets to her is that she has a complicated relationship with her grandparents, who raised her because her parents died when she was a baby. And they're complicated people. And there is a narrative that Catalina experiences, and I've definitely experienced, of sort of family worship in the Latino cultural context, where it feels like in order to be a Latina or a Latin person, there needs to be an element of just indebtedness to your grandparents, your parents. They had a sacrifice, and the original sacrifice can never be repaid, but you constantly have to strive towards repaying it. I think not just Latino kids, like lots of kids of immigrants, lots of kids of parents who sacrifice so much feel this. We understand the sense of indebtedness. But then if the narrative is also that you have to love your family and they have to love you and you have to be close, and you have to romanticize your ancestors, and you have to think of your ancestors as it created pressure on Catalina where she wasn't able to fully have her feelings and her breakdown because she felt like it would have been a betrayal to her suffering family for her to feel hurt by them, or it would have been a betrayal to her very few Latina professors for her to be struggling academically. She can't really fail or experience suffering in a really free way because she's sort of feels like she's being watched, again, in terms of this debt that she has to repay. And I think that's like a very real conflict that a lot of us feel, so I wanted to depict it.
Yeah, that really came out. One thing I wanted to ask you about is the book is dedicated to Vanessa Guillén. And across the novel, there's a number of references to violence against women across the Americas. Carolina. And the main character is writing a thesis, a senior thesis on violence as depicted in Roberto Bolaño's amazing novel, 2666. There's, if you could talk about that, because it seems like that's a theme that is carried through violence against women. Maybe first explain for folks who don't remember who Vanessa Guillén is, why you dedicated the book to her and the role of violence against women in the novel.
Vanessa Guillén was in the army. She was Latina. She was a child of, I believe, undocumented immigrants. And she was brutally assaulted and murdered and dismembered and buried in an army base. And the higher-ups in the army made it impossible for her family to find closure because they blocked justice at every level. They blocked accountability for the perpetrators. They hid the sexual harassment that had happened at that army base and that Vanessa had been complaining about for so long. And her story really resonated with me because she looks like all the girls I grew up with. And she looks like girls who are in my life now and who I love and feel protective of. And I knew that it was hard to ignore the fact that so much of why she was being ignored and her death was being trivialized was because she was a Latina. And I think Latinas are kind of an unprotected class in this country. I think part of it has to do with the fact that you're kind of outside the racial binary. You are not white or you're not Black in the sense that you are not a white American or a Black American. Latinos can be all sorts of different types of people, but you are outside of the binary. And I think that that makes people feel like they're a perpetual other, like we're a perpetual other. So I dedicated the book to her because I was really angry at, and continue to be angry at the rhetoric around immigrants, the rhetoric around Latinas. And I wanted it to be kind of like a public memorial to her because it was in a physical space. I describe like public memorials in Queens where I grew up in the book. And so I felt like kind of doing one myself.
Thank you. And speaking about what you were talking about earlier about the pressures on Latinos in universities, one of the pressures is figuring out their relationship to the so-called homeland, right? And especially if they haven't been to the homeland, then that relationship is fraught. And it seems like Catalina's relationship with Ecuador is fraught. And she had all these people, her boyfriend, the white boy, explaining, he's an expert, a budding anthropologist who knows everything about Ecuador. His father is a big fan of filmmaker, and so she's got all these experts in her life. Her grandfather loves to explain all the history of Ecuador and Latin America, but her relationship to the homeland is kind of undefined, or she seems to be getting things and resisting almost what these folks are offering as what the homeland is. In the novel, you also develop the idea of the ipu, the stringed record-keeping device that's created by the Incas. And Harvard has a collection of them, and they're trying to unravel the secrets. So could you talk about how you see or how the Kipu functions in the novel, and just these questions of memory and connections to the homeland?
Catalina is undocumented, so she can't leave the country, and so she hasn't been to Ecuador since she was a baby. And all the knowledge she has about Ecuador are her grandfather, who just loves giving long lectures after dinner, and the professors at Harvard. And she talks about how, because anthropology, anything she wants to learn about Latin America has to be in literature or in anthropology. There's no Latin American historian. And so she and many other Latino, they're the first in their family to go to college, they have the opportunity to learn about their cultures or their ancestors in these anthropology classes. So you have all of these Latino kids flocking to like history of the Andes, history of the Maya, and that's shocking to her. That's hard for her. Like, she has to have secondhand knowledge from men who go around like collecting stories. It's hard for her. And as someone who, again, there's so much stigma against being bilingual, against Spanglish, against being from here and there and from neither place, whatever. And so I wanted to make it clear also to my readers that here was a character who was grappling with what it meant to be from Ecuador and what it meant to be American and what it meant to be an American without papers. And I wanted her to be able to not have access to the answers all the time, and for that still to be okay. So she doesn't necessarily know too much about how her parents died in the car crash, and she gets all of these stories that she thinks might be lies. But it's important for her to be able to work through those feelings without them being solved.
Spoiler alert, Grandpa steals a cuckoo from the museum. And I thought that was a great metaphor for taking back your history when other people are trying to steal it and understand it, but you take it back. So that's just something I really liked in the story. Well, it's 2 o'clock. Let me open it up. I have other questions, but I'll open it up for folks who might have questions for you. If not, I'll just continue.
So we read the first book in class with excerpts, and I think that you do a really fantastic job of combating a lot of the dehumanizing narratives that especially have been increasing in the form they exist now. Excuse me. So what in your opinion would be some of the best ways for the average person to combat these narratives in their daily life? Because like we've explained, they're coming back in their disease.
I honestly just think just feeling genuine curiosity and trying to stir up genuine curiosity for yourself about other people and just not assume that you know anything about them. I think that is so simple, but it goes a real long way. I think one of the reasons Americans have this hard time with immigrants is because we remind them of the worst possible scenarios of climate change, poverty, regime change, dictatorships. That these things can happen here too. It can happen to us. You have you have Venezuelans right now who are like ophthalmologists and are really struggling to make good sandwiches because that's not their job, but they had to come here. Like that, for instance, that detail that I gave, because I know people who I've talked to them, and so I'm able to not just see them as like recently arrived migrants, right? I am able to put faces and stories, and this person likes this and this person's not. So, you know, just express curiosity about people, I think.
Yes.
You talked about your own struggles for mental health, and I think that issue for people of color, mental health, because therapy is always about the individual. But when we deal with our mental health, it's political, social, cultural. So I'm curious about your own experiences and what you've learned about how to recover and improve your mental health.
It's been a really long journey. I have a therapist now who is Argentine and who lives in Florida and who works with the children of the disappeared from Argentina and Chile. And she has we have a certain shorthand that I can use with her, where she understands that personal pain can be tied to your country's history, and can be tied to things that you have no control over, like dictatorships and war. I have been to many therapists, many therapists before, who have said all sorts of outrageous things about me and my family, and who have blamed me for just being in pain, for having been a traumatized child. Like, I had 2 changes in caregivers by the time I was 5. And my parents left me when I was 18 months old, which had devastating impacts on the development of my brain. Again, I'm a monster. And so it was really hard for them to say that I was like toxic, that I had borderline personality disorder, that I've been diagnosed with just about everything. And it wasn't until my therapist now that I've been able to talk about being left, and also how scary it was to come to America at 5 years old and just be put into an English classroom with these strangers. These are the first time I'm having these conversations, but I've been in mental health treatment of one kind or another since I was 21. So it's taken a really long time for someone to be able to see me in the full context, and not just in terms of behaviors. Like, behaviors happen because of the context. So I deeply hope that everyone who struggles with their mental health is able to eventually find someone, but it is going to be a journey. But don't give up, because it really is, it's transformative, I think, when you stop blaming yourself.
Jackie?
So I'm Jackie. I teach in modern languages, and I had the amazing privilege of teaching Undocumented Americans during the pandemic, the very first quarter online. And because I didn't know what the heck was going on in the world, and I didn't know what we were going to do, and I didn't feel that, the traditional pedagogy was going to work for me that particular quarter, we did it like in a book club style that I was like so happy with, right? Like, it just turned out to be a really intimate and really healing experience for the group of people, that it was supposed to be a asynchronous course, and we would meet optionally, like synchronously, if you wanted to discuss the novels, and it was always full, right? And it was mostly Latinas actually that would show up at each one of these novels, and all we did was reflect on them, read and reflect, right? And I taught like Dominicana that quarter, like I taught a bunch of novels that were just like really about exploring ourselves. And like I said, it was just a really healing, amazing experience. One of the things that I think that I recall was something that you referred to that I want to understand just a little bit better, which is, you talked about how you wanted to, like, you were aware that you were dealing with these narratives and that you were very intentional about wanting to fuck them up. And I'm wondering, are you referring, excuse me, are you referring specifically to the narrative of exceptionalism? Because I think a lot of times we're thinking that the narrative is like this narrative of like the deficit narrative, which we're all familiar with. But it seemed to me like, and I think that this came out a lot in our conversations about your book, was that there's also this narrative of exceptionalism that we're burdened by, and that sometimes we're complicit. And so I'm wondering if that's the narrative that you kind of were thinking about when you said that. And, you know, I think that there were times where you were actually engaging this idea of like our complicity with it. I don't know if I'm right about that. So I was curious about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been tainted with associations with Ivy League institutions since I was 18 years old. So hard to deny that, right? However, I feel like I know what the scripts are by now, and I make the choice with how to engage with them. And I feel like everyone should have a choice. Everyone should have the ability to decide how they move through the world if the world has already decided that you're the pawn on the chessboard, right? I think that I try to push the envelope when I can, because I feel like the visibility as a publicly visible immigrant who has a stacked resume. So when I am in an interview setting and I have the opportunity to call someone out or to disagree or to correct the record, I think the way that I present myself as a public person is just also very deliberate. It's not necessarily what I'm like in private, because I know that I am representing perhaps a different narrative or a different story. You know, I also feel like a working class kid through and through. And so I know where my loyalties lie. And like my loyalties lie with my people and with people who find themselves marginalized, queer people, other people of color, trans people, whoever has found themselves to be utterly dismissed and treated by the world with disgust. That's where my loyalties lie. So, you know, that's just kind of how I think that I approach the very, very niche kind of attention that you get like in bookstores. You know, I was really scared with the Undocumented Americans that my audience was, no disrespect to them, some of my best friends are white ladies in the suburbs, but I didn't want to be a beloved writer by white ladies in the suburbs who would be inspired by my sad story. I wanted to be respected as a writer. And I'm really happy that when I do like my book events, I do see like really diverse audiences. I see a lot of young people. I see a ton of Latinas who come all dressed up to the nines. And I am really happy to have created a space where we could kind of just be ourselves without having to, without how oppressive it is to constantly be reacting to scripts and narratives about yourself. It's hard to just be. So it's also I tried to do in Catalina, just tried to give her some room to breathe.
Yes.
You touched on the subject of not doubting your intelligence or your intellectual ability and this higher institution of higher education, right? But you did mention how you did maybe doubt, or you wrote about doubting yourself in different aspects. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, on how, like, on the struggles of being an immigrant or a Latina person navigating an institution of higher education for the first time.
It was really hard. You know, when I was in a class with other students who had gone to prep school or just to better schools than I had, I definitely felt the difference. I had never taken Latin. I didn't take calculus. My school didn't offer physics. And at Harvard, like in order to meet the basic requirements, you have to take the science, physics or whatever. And so especially in those areas, in the math and sciences, I deeply felt that I had not gotten a great education in high school. I also was very poor, and my parents were very poor. And just basic things like having a winter jacket, having waterproof boots. Nobody really thought about that in terms of like, kid got a full ride to Harvard. And it's like, yeah, but now I'm here and I'm poor still, and I can't legally work. It was hard. I think part of the public facing persona that I built was based on feeling myself to sort of being really vulnerable and really scared and feeling really fragile. One of the hardest things was being in a place where the only people that I saw who looked like me were in the janitorial staff and in the dining staff, because then my heart always went out to them, and I always thought of my mom and dad, and it created this weird like sense in me that I was living one life as like a college kid, and yet I was constantly thinking about my parents and how hard they worked and all those things. So it wasn't like I was like lost in the college experience, so it's hard. And I think that first generation students in general probably have a lot of those same experiences even now. I'm sure you guys have. Yes.
So I'm an immigrant student too. And I was wondering, what are some things like you think about to try to, I guess, stay hopeful for like academically and I guess for the future? Like if you feel like certain things are against you, might find out that there's like a new thing they gotta think about as well.
So the question was like what I think like what
Yeah.
I sort of built my confidence up based on what motivates me. I'm very motivated by my nemesis. I like having an enemy. It really motivates me when I'm writing. In order to feel agitated enough to want to write, I have to be thinking about somebody. So for the first book, it was Stephen Miller. I thought about him constantly. In fact, one of my friends who's an actual journalist and who writes about immigration interviewed Stephen Miller for a profile. And for my birthday, he let me listen to like an unpublished recording of him saying, again, it's like a perverse, I think it's inclination. For this book, I actually dedicated the front of the book to Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio. And I think about them a lot. I don't know if thinking about your enemies is a helpful answer, but like for this book, it was like Teddy Roosevelt, Hunter S. Thompson, Philip Roth. Thought about sort of I'm motivated by mischief and I think by fun. I am a very depressive person, but I grew up, especially with my brother, who's 10 years younger than I am. We grew up in gallows humor and using humor and dark humor to get through things. Like the thing that my mom said most often when I was growing up was like, "Nothing, guys, so don't say that, don't say that." And that's helped me. Seeing the, I also really think it's important to romanticize your life. I do think that. I think that I can survive just about anything if I can romanticize it, which is why I think I became a writer. Again, there's a scene in the book where I say something like, only a poet could stop by like a daffodil on the side of the highway and find beauty in it. And I obviously have felt and feel like a daffodil by the side of the highway, and I can find beauty in it. So I think making sure that you nurture and take care of your own feeling of dignity, I think that's important.
You spoke a little bit about like, how you were scared to start elections going on, or when I left it, and how you were scared. Now that into writing your notes? Do you feel like now you would change anything on that process?
Whether I would change anything?
Yeah, we're writing that book.
That's a really good question. I think that I got a lot of praise for saying that I was not, I said I didn't want to put on the drag of a journalist while writing this. Like I wanted to be affected by the people that I wrote about. And I was, I mean, you can read about it there. But I think that things is not sustainable. Like if a journalist, and I have friends who work on the border, who write about abortion rights, who write about detention centers, for them to put themselves out there for every person that they met and to give themselves and to feel their suffering, they would burn out very quickly and they would be completely burdened by stress and PTSD and all those things themselves. So I think there was kind of a romantic way that outsiders sort of viewed at what I did. And they were like, I mean, it's terrific that she was in Flint, Michigan, thinking about drinking the lead water because she felt so guilty that she had been spared. But I think that isn't sustainable as a young Latina who wants to make a career writing. Like, I realize that publishers are not going to be looking out for my mental health. It's going to be me. But I'm glad that I wrote this book. And it is just my approach to living in the world that I relate to other people and I feel deeply for them. And I don't want to change that about myself, but I do want to be careful about how, when I extend so much of myself to.
You know, you talked about how you feel that you like romanticize your own life, and and also kind of like speaking of a lot of things like mental health struggle and stuff that that I've seen in my own life, being driven in a way by spite of people. And it made me think when you're talking about writing Catalina, how it's a very solitary thing. But also, again, that you struggle with all these different things. And I know that, like you said, like that is in its own way kind of a romanticization of that. And I was wondering how much of writing that book was like difficult, in it being semi-autobiographical. How much of it was a thing that you had to get through, but also how much of it was a thing that you were able to get out.
That's a good question. I think with writing, it's always, for me, a way of like exercising demons from my body. The way that they're like big running people are like, I have to go for like a 25-mile run today because I need to clear my head. Writing to me is helpful for doing that. And I do consider myself to be someone who has demons to be exercised. Writing, I often don't know what I think about something or how I feel about something unless I write it. I have a complicated relationship with writing in that I don't do it for fun or I don't do it privately. I have a hard time even keeping a journal. Like I write my thoughts down, obviously, but they have to be thoughts for publishing. And I'm working on all of that in therapy. But I think part of it comes to, I grew up Catholic, and when I was like little, I was like 9, I remember thinking, if God can read my thoughts, can know my thoughts, that meant that the only place where I had privacy, which was in my own head, I didn't even have that anymore. Because I grew up in like a railroad apartment without doors. The only place where I had solitude was inside my own head, and then God was in it. And then I also realized, because this is what I was taught, that Satan could read my thoughts because that's how he would know how to tempt me. And so I also was like, I don't want to give Satan more information about myself by writing in my 5th grade diary about what boys I liked. So I think that I started not wanting to put things down on paper. Also, growing up undocumented really does impact your psychology. I change my phone number a lot. I don't give out my phone number, and I try not to write down what I truly feel or think in case of surveillance by the state or by the heavens.
Can you talk about who you, or your audience, who you imagined as your audience for each of these? Was it the same audience, a different ones?
Thing is, like, no one has the career that I want. Like, there's men who have the career that I want. But there are many Latina writers that I admire, and I am absolutely on their shoulders. But I was really kind of fumbling in the dark. And like I said, I was really scared that people were gonna see me as this like really inspirational figure. And I also was scared of being used as propaganda because again, I mean, cute kid, grows up, goes to Harvard, etc. And so I just really did not want to be seen as a poster child for anything. And writing was a way for, sounds corny, but for me to be able to tell my own story about myself and about the people that I cared about.
So you didn't have a specific audience in mind, you were.
My editor worked really hard to get me to stop writing for a white audience. And what he meant by that is for an imagined white audience, where I would be constantly be defensive or be explaining things or be trying to convince, to win a moral argument, basically that I deserve to exist. And so, once he helped me understand that, I truly wrote the author who spoke earlier, the romance, I forget her name, she was speaking about quoting Toni Morrison, if there's a book that you want to read, but it doesn't exist, that you want to read, write it. And so the truth is I wrote it for an audience of one, which was myself.
Cool. And are you writing anything now, or what, do you have an idea for the next book?
So the way that I'm handling that question right now is that my editor has not been giving me as much attention as I'd like. He also publishes Ta-Nehisi Coates, and and so he's been a little busy with a superstar. And so what I'm doing is I'm telling people that maybe I won't write another book. Sure, I have a contract to write another book, but he could put the Random House lawyers on me. That's okay. So that's how I'm choosing to publicly answer that. But you know, of course, one does have to pay the bills, etc. So maybe you'll hear from me, maybe you won't.
Thank you.